To be in North Dakota. I live in California. You don't have to understand anything more than that. No, to everybody here, the organization, the organizers, my new friends in North Dakota, Margot Knorr and her family, I want to thank everyone for inviting me back. The last time I was here was 20 below zero, so this is a good break. I'm going to echo a lot of things that many of the other speakers have already said, and that's good. I was recently, about a week or two ago, invited to, I'm not going to use the mic, I'm sorry, I can't hold it and do this. I was invited by the New College of Florida to give the commencement speech. And that's a small school in Sarasota that Governor DeSantis is trying to make a change. Getting back to actually what's called classical liberalism instead of what may be called wokeism as the thrust of universities. And you can imagine the reception I was given. I learned from Riley's experience a couple weeks earlier, and therefore I made sure that there were a couple dozen police officers guarding the stage, and that was actually useful for me. What excited me most about speaking there was the new college's stated commitment, quote, to free speech and civil discourse, unquote. Because in my opinion, that is the most urgently needed change in the country today. Both civil discourse and the free exchange of ideas must be restored. We have lost our basic humanity to our fellow Americans. The college campus is supposed to be America's center for the free exchange of ideas, essential to finding truth, fundamental to all free societies. College is here, I told them, to challenge young people. It's not to protect them from ideas that they may not like. It is crucial for students to hear ideas from many sources, especially ideas they don't agree with. That is the key part of learning how to think critically. It is literally impossible to learn critical thinking without hearing different views. And critical thinking is the most important lesson to learn in college. In most ways, life after college is one with far more freedom than that environment. And there is no country with greater freedom, with more choices than this country. But with that freedom comes responsibility. And our country needs help from our younger generation. I was asked to help our country during the biggest healthcare crisis in a century. As a health policy scholar for more than 15 years and a medical scientist and physician for more than 30 years, I was called up by the White House in July of 2020. And I was asked, would you come to speak to the president? And of course I said, well, yes. And I remembered at the time the words of my friend and Hoover colleague, General Jim Mattis, who told me the day he was headed to Washington to be President Trump's Secretary of Defense, he said to me, Scott, President of the United States asked me to serve. The answer is yes, sir, period. After a day of meetings in the White House, I was asked by Jared Kushner to help advise President Trump. I replied, okay, but I just want to tell you what you're going to get here. I said, I'm not going to sign on to any group statement that somebody else wants me to if I don't agree with it. I'm not going to agree with something that someone else says just because I'm told to agree. And I'm not going to change my mind if I don't agree. I don't care who tells me to change my mind. And Jared said to me, well, that's exactly why we want you. And I said, oh, wow. I mean, I'm really happy to hear that. And then he warned, but I'm concerned they're going to try to destroy you once it's public. And so I was shocked, first, because I didn't think he would actually care if they destroyed me. But second, because that didn't sound so great to me. I wasn't a political person. I had no intention of being a political person. So I said, well, how about if I go back to California? I'm going to try from there. And he said, okay, let's do that. And within a few days, it was obvious. I mean, this was in late July 2020. The country was panicking. The decisions were being made. The president was being fed wrong, harmful policies pushed by career bureaucrats who lacked both knowledge and critical thinking. And so I went back. My concern, my work, my entire motivation in the White House was focused on one thing: to stop people from dying from the pandemic and its management, both the harms of the virus and the impact on the public health of the policies. That is the importance of having people who are health policy experts. That's my field. Much broader scope of expertise than that of any virologist or epidemiologist, and certainly more than any career government bureaucrat. On reflection about that experience, it is a great blessing to have been given the opportunity. It's a rare opportunity to help your country in a time of crisis. Most people never get that chance to try to do so much good for so many. And I always like to say to young people, and there are a few in this audience, who might find themselves in this situation, and some undoubtedly will, that no matter how difficult it may seem to speak the truth, even against a tidal wave of hostility, character assassination, and national and international media, death threats requiring 24/7 police security surrounding my home and in my driveway for weeks, backstabbing from my own employer, it was never even a remote consideration to stop speaking up. Why not? Well, because people were dying, and I know right from wrong. They were dying from the Birx-Fauci lockdowns that were contrary to the data, to fundamental biology, and a simple logic. That had to be called out. I knew the data. I had to try to change that. Second, it became apparent, although I wasn't aware of this when I first started, that so many people needed to hear those facts spoken logically and clearly. I received hundreds of emails per day, thousands, from everyday working people, seniors, doctors and scientists, teachers, priests praying for me. Fathers and mothers whose husbands and daughters had committed suicide from the isolation and the lockdowns, who begged me in their emails to keep speaking because they were afraid and because they were afraid to speak up. And I would never let them down. The press never understood that motivation. My responsibility to others completely dwarfed the media's slurs and criticisms and the politicized attacks from Stanford University, my own employer. And third, I had the backing of the strongest, most ethical person I have ever known, my wife. Who I met in the Big Ten in college, by the way, not the SEC. Now let's briefly consider some facts, and I usually show these on slides, but I'm going to go through them pretty quickly. We must acknowledge, of course, the pandemic was a great tragedy. There is no doubt about that, but it has exposed profound issues in the United States that threaten the very principles of freedom that we Americans take for granted. Under two administrations, Trump and Biden, the United States management of the pandemic was a failure. In COVID deaths per million, among the worst compared to our peer nations, a straight line of increase, if you look at a graph, from March 1st, 2020 through April 2022. 2 full years, no change in the rate of deaths per day, 2 presidents, even after vaccine on December 16th, 2020. Any judgment of the U.S. response lies at the hands of Drs. Deborah Birx, Anthony Fauci, the CDC, and the university experts who convinced officials to implement their lockdown strategy, and on our elected leaders who abrogated the responsibility to lead and instead hid behind those incompetent people. The lockdowners got what they wanted. Their policies were implemented throughout most of this country in almost all states. Their policies failed. They failed to stop the death. They failed to stop the infection from spreading. But in addition, they inflicted massive health damages, death, and destruction, particularly heinously on low-income families and our children. This was the biggest, the most tragic, the most unethical breakdown of public health leadership in modern history. America's media is slowly acknowledging facts that refute the original reasons behind lockdowns and school closures. It shouldn't be partisan because both the Trump and Biden administrations rejected the standard pandemic science. That was Henderson's 2006 classic review, 15 years earlier, that clearly stated two things. Lockdowns were not effective and lockdowns were extremely harmful. Both these administrations rejected the alternative targeted protection, the safer, scientifically valid, and standard pandemic management that was first advised in national media in March of 2020 by three people, Johnny Anides, David Katz, and myself independently, and then repeatedly for months, and then echoed 7 months later by something called the Great Barrington Declaration, that we should employ increased protection of the elderly and the higher risk people because the lockdowns were not protecting them, and reopen schools and businesses to stop destroying children and the poor. That data was not learned in late 2020 or 2021 or 2022. It was all known in spring of 2020 from data all over the world. My advice was rejected with rare exceptions, like a state you hear about in the news now, Florida. People in Florida were the lucky ones. They had open schools, no lockdown since late summer 2020, and they have been living normally for 3 years. Florida avoided the lockdown harms, and yes, even with its elderly high-risk population, after 2 full years, had better age-adjusted COVID deaths than 60% of the states, had lower excess death increase, that is, deaths beyond what you would have without a pandemic, than my own, much younger state of California. That's fact. Americans need to learn to disregard fabrications of untruthful media and politicians. Why did Americans accept these draconian, unprecedented, and illogical lockdowns? This is the question. First, 2 lies were told to convince the public that frightened the public. Number one, if you're against lockdowns, you're choosing the economy over lives. That was contrary to decades of economic literature, showing severe economic downturns literally kill people. It was always lives versus lives. The second was, if you're against lockdowns, you're for, quote, letting it rip, the so-called herd immunity strategy. This was an outright lie. No one ever suggested doing that. That was never even mentioned in any White House meeting I ever attended. I never advised it to President Trump. I never even heard it discussed. That is not the same thing as targeted protection. What is that? That's propaganda. That's propaganda distributed through a dishonest media reminiscent of lies that were told during the most heinous regimes in modern history to demonize opposing groups as dangerous to others. We must live in a society where facts matter. And this is the data. Bjornskov, March 2021, quote, more severe lockdown policies have not been associated with lower mortality, unquote. The lockdowns did not reduce the deaths. Ben David, Stanford, January 2021, quote, we do not find significant benefits on case growth. That means the lockdowns did not prevent the spread of the infection. Agarwal, Rand Institute and USC, June 2021. The lockdown policies in 43 countries and across the United States, individual states, led to more excess deaths. The deaths were coming down, the lockdowns were instituted, and more people died. Herbie, Johns Hopkins, January 22. COVID mortality was reduced by only 0.2% and should be rejected as a pandemic policy, unquote. Kirpin, Moore, Mulligan, University of Chicago, February 2023. Florida and South Dakota, states that opened early, were among the states with the best performance on death, education, and employment. The worst performing states were those with the most stringent lockdowns. Illinois, 46th, California, 47th, New Mexico, 48th, New York, 49th, Washington, D.C., 50th, and New Jersey, 51st. The lockdowners got their policies implemented. Their policies failed. That's fact. That's the data. That's not arguable. To say otherwise is saying the earth is flat. But those same people, the lockdowners, now run from accountability, and even worse, using logic that sounds like Kafka or Alice in Wonderland's Mad Hatter, and in fact sounds like the meetings of the task force to me. They blame those who oppose the lockdowns and mandates for the failure of the lockdowns and mandates that were implemented. Truth may be prevailing, but being proven right is not the point. We have witnessed something more fundamental than a pandemic mismanagement. We have witnessed a shocking ethical breakdown in this country, a failure of leadership, one that has created a crisis of trust in public health and institutions we need as a democratic and diverse society. Human rights were violated in the United States. Guarantees of the most fundamental freedoms upon which this country was founded, speech, religion, assembly, were suddenly reversed by lockdowners under the guise of the science or safety. Any free society, especially this one, founded on guaranteed liberty from government power in its Constitution and Bill of Rights, must be managed in concert with its system of laws even during health emergencies. And this nation, with its Declaration of Independence explicitly defining freedoms of individuals as, quote, endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, unquote, it is a stunning violation that liberty fell so quickly and thoroughly by government decree and that the people allowed it. And we must all recognize something else, the other reality unacknowledged by those in power, that when freedom disappears, it mostly harms minorities and the poor, not the affluent, not those in power. And now we are faced with a tremendous challenge as a nation, how to restore that trust and the values required of an ethical society. Well, do we truly have a problem in the ethical leadership in this country? Well, let's consider America's school lockdown policies. Almost all Western Europe recognized the data in 2020, proving the minuscule risk to healthy children for serious illness. They opened their schools even during otherwise stringent lockdowns in 2020 to 21. America's governors mostly closed in-person schools for that school year, as advised, by the way, by our largest teachers' unions and supported, whether you like to hear it or not, by most teachers, who by that behavior have wholly disqualified themselves from being entrusted to teach our children. What happened during America's school closures? Hundreds of thousands of child abuse cases went unreported, since schools are the #1 agency where child abuse is noticed. Severe child abuse exploded. Mental health disorders, severe anxiety, depression in teenagers and college-age kids skyrocketed. Self-harm by teenagers, putting out cigarettes on their skin, slashing their wrists, doubled to tripled compared to the previous year. Overdoses and substance use disorders in teenagers increased by 40 to 120%. Massive learning losses directly from the shutdowns. The largest score drops in math since the first assessments more than 30 years ago, and as highlighted by UNICEF's 2022 update, these harms and learning losses were, quote, disproportionately affected students from disadvantaged backgrounds and are concentrated among poor students, unquote. The Birx-Fauci lockdowns were a luxury of the rich, I call it. They spared the affluent, they shifted the burden of this thing, this illness, this response to the working class, to minorities and the poor. I thought we were a society that cared about the poor and low-income families, that prioritized our children. And let's compare America's COVID vaccine policies in children to our peer nations. The UK, September 21, quote, the margin of benefit is too small to support universal vaccination of otherwise healthy teenagers, unquote. Finland, June 2021, quote, people under 16 who are not in a high-risk group will not be vaccinated in Finland, unquote. Norway, 2020, and again in 2022, quote, for children who are offered the vaccine, vaccination is voluntary, unquote. Denmark, 2022, quote, it will no longer be possible for children and young people under 18 to get the vaccine, unquote. The US, October 26, 2021, quote, we're never going to learn about how safe the vaccine is unless we start giving it. That's just the way it goes. That was Eric Rubin, editor-in-chief, New England Journal of Medicine, and advisor to the FDA Committee on Pediatric Vaccines. Nelson Mandela said there can be no keener revelation of a society's soul than the way in which it treats its children. Across the U.S., almost all colleges and universities require testing, vaccination, and boosters in healthy asymptomatic young people, and some still do, even now in 2023. Yet back in October 2020, before any vaccine, when the virus was in its most lethal form, the CDC had posted on its website for schools, quote, "It is unethical and illegal to test someone who doesn't want to be tested." That CDC posting has been removed. It cannot be found. Meanwhile, many of our so-called elite medical centers, Duke, Johns Hopkins, Stanford, where I work, engage in a clinical trial sponsored by money from Pfizer, the vaccine maker, injecting healthy infants and toddlers with their experimental drug for a disease they have no significant risk from. Is that now America's standard for medical ethics? And even if it were true that the vaccines prevent the spread of the infection, which it does not, by all of the world's data, what kind of society uses its children as human shields for adults? I am a father. I am a shield. It's hard to say that without being emotional, but I am a shield for my children. They are not to be used as shields for me. Beyond the death and destruction, beyond the exploding psychological harms, the self-harms, the suicides, the anxiety, the depression, the explosion in hospitalizing kids under 16 for eating disorders, from the isolation, not the virus, we have set up a public health disaster in our younger kids. During the lockdown, more than half of college-age kids had an unwanted weight gain that averaged 28 pounds. That's an obesity epidemic. And we have taught very young children, toddlers, that they are a disease vector, that they are a danger to everyone, and everyone is a danger to them. Where I live in Palo Alto, you see people walking their toddlers with masks on, even today. Kids, babies in their strollers with masks on in Palo Alto, California. Mackey said, quote, "Of all the offspring of time, error is the most ancient and is so old and familiar an acquaintance that truth, when discovered, comes upon most of us like an intruder and meets the intruder's welcome." What was the response to hearing truth, especially on our university campuses, the centers for the free exchange of ideas? The response was censorship, intimidation, character assassination, and censure. And let's understand clearly, when you censor science and health policy, it's not simply an abstract evil, a less than ideal environment for diverse views or creative thinking. People die, and people died from the censorship of correct science policy. I fear for our students and our country. Without permitting, without indeed encouraging open debate, we might never solve any future crisis. But it's not only the matter of academic freedom that needs comment. Many faculty members of our acclaimed universities are now dangerously intolerant of opinions contrary to their favored narrative. And some employ toxic smears and organized rebukes against those of us who disagreed with what was implemented and who dared to help the country, our country, their country, under a president they happen to despise, apparently the ultimate transgression. But defamatory attacks, character assassination, this is not acceptable in a civilized society, let alone in our great universities. Worse than a violation of ethical behavior among colleagues, it does not meet my standard of simple human decency. If influential university board members, if illustrious graduates, if academic leaders fail to step up and renounce that shameful conduct, many experts, many more, with a reputation to lose, will be unwilling to serve their country in contentious times. As parents, as citizens, as educators, that would be the worst possible legacy to leave to our children, the next generation of stewards of this country. Some call for simply forgiving and forgetting the unconscionable decisions to close schools and implement these reckless lockdowns. No, that must not be allowed. Why? Because truth matters in an ethical society. The public needs to know the truth, especially after all they've been through. Because we must succeed in the next pandemic, the next inevitable crisis. And not if we want to restore trust. That requires, as a start, demanding the admission of failure and a public apology by lockdown advocates. to add accountability so they never impose these policies again. Now, I'm not naive to think that they will give that apology. They will not apologize. They will never apologize. In fact, I said, and I was quoted in this Israeli interview 2 years ago, I said they will never admit that COVID is finished. And I'm not sure that they will ever admit, really, in parts of this country. This is North Dakota. This is not California. Aristotle argued that the distinct function of a human being is reasoning or thinking critically, that what he called the life worth living is one in which we reason well. He explained that freedom is the necessary predicate to reason and to choose a virtuous life. During the 2020 pandemic, America fell short as a virtuous society by all definitions, whether secular or religious. And that failure is now on display throughout our society. It's beyond the pandemic. The pandemic, to me, exposed these issues. So what can we do now? First, and we've heard this many times already in this meeting, each one of us, we have the burden of becoming critical thinkers, to make the best decisions for ourselves and our families. The era of accepting what so-called experts say simply based on their titles alone must be over. Learn the facts, use critical thinking, and then form the opinion. That's the order, by the way, not the reverse. Second, we have a disastrous void in courage in American society today. Of the 4 cardinal virtues, courage is the predicate for all the others. As C.S. Lewis said, courage is not simply one of the virtues, but the form of every virtue at the testing point. If our democracy, with its defining freedoms, is to survive, we need good people, individuals with integrity, and there are many, to rise up. What does rise up mean? Rise up means speak up, as we are allowed, as we are expected to do in a free society, or we have no chance. And third, we have a shocking deficit of moral, virtuous leadership in America. Amidst America's recovery from this debacle, our country urgently needs unity and strength, yet Americans have become more divided. Instead of unifying our citizens, our elected leaders, including several presidents in a row, and several means more than 2, have been divisive, oblivious to their larger responsibility after they are elected to represent all Americans, even those who did not vote for them. We need our younger generation to reinstate the moral backbone, the ethical compass, and the basic civility that is disappearing from this country. We cannot have a civil society if it is filled with people, led by people, who refuse to allow discussion of views counter to their own. We desperately need leadership that unites, not divides. Leaders with a moral compass who know right from wrong, who believe in strong family values. Leaders who are not afraid to defend our precious freedoms, America's hard-earned freedoms that uniquely provide opportunities sought by millions the world over. We need leaders with integrity, or this country as an ethical society, as a virtuous society, as a free and diverse society is in serious trouble. Finally, we must teach our children to have courage and to never forget what G.K. Chesterton said. Right is right, even if nobody does it. Wrong is wrong, even if everybody is wrong about it. Thank you.